The dust had settled into every crease of Reverend Samuel Whitmore's weathered face by the time he reached the Morrison homestead, though the wind still carried the scent of rain that would never come. His horse, a mare named Patience, picked her way through the scattered stones and dried brush with the careful step of an animal that had learned to trust neither the ground beneath her hooves nor the sky above. The sun hung low and merciless, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the small wooden house, like fingers of some great hand, grasping for something that had already been lost. Samuel had been riding the circuit for near on 20 years now, carrying the word of God to settlements so remote that they seemed forgotten by both heaven and earth. He had seen drought turn men to wolves and plenty turn them to fools, had witnessed the birth of hope in the most barren places, and watched it die just as quickly. But there was something about this particular stretch of land that made his chest tighten with an unease he couldn't name. The Morrison place sat in a shallow valley between two hills, isolated even by frontier standards. And as he approached, he noticed the peculiar stillness that seemed to hang over everything like a shroud. The house itself was well built, but showing signs of neglect. Shutters hanging slightly askew, a porch rail that had come loose at one end, weeds growing tall against the foundation. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line that dissipated quickly in the dry air, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the lowing of cattle. Normal sounds of homestead life, yet something felt wrong in a way that made his skin crawl and his hand unconsciously move to the worn leather Bible tucked into his saddlebag. As he dismounted and tied Patience to the hitching post, Samuel called out in the customary manner of travelers seeking hospitality. "Hello, the house!" His voice carried across the empty yard, but the only response was the creak of the loose porch rail in the wind. He waited hat in hand, feeling the weight of unseen eyes upon him. In his experience, frontier families were quick to emerge when strangers arrived, either to welcome them or to warn them away. But the Morrison house remained silent as a tomb. After several minutes, the front door opened slowly, and a woman emerged onto the porch. She was perhaps 35, with prematurely gray hair pulled back severely and eyes that held the hollow look of someone who had stared too long into an abyss. Her dress, once probably blue, had faded to the color of old bruises, and her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, trembled slightly despite the heat. "Ma'am," Samuel said, replacing his hat and offering a slight bow. "I'm Reverend Whitmore, traveling through on my circuit. I was hoping you might have room for a weary traveler to rest for the night, and perhaps we could share in some worship together." The woman, who must be Sarah Morrison, though she hadn't introduced herself, studied him with the wariness of a rabbit scenting a fox. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. We don't have much call for preaching here, Reverend. Perhaps you'd best move on to the next settlement?" There was something in her tone, a desperate quality that made Samuel's pastoral instincts sharpen. He had heard that same note in the voices of those who carried burdens too heavy for their souls to bear, and he recognized the look in her eyes as one he'd seen in the faces of the truly damned. Not damned by God, but by circumstances that had stripped away every vestige of hope and left only the hollow shell of survival. "I don't ask for much, ma'am," he said gently. "Just a place to rest my horse and perhaps a cup of water. I've been riding since dawn, and the next settlement is a hard day's journey." He paused, studying her face. "Sometimes the Lord sends us exactly where we need to be, even when we don't understand why." Something flickered across her features, a brief war between fear and desperate longing. Behind her, he caught a glimpse of movement in the darkened doorway, a shadow that resolved into the figure of a man. Thomas Morrison stepped onto the porch, and Samuel immediately understood why Sarah had looked so afraid. The man was tall and gaunt, with the kind of hardness that came from too many years of fighting against a world that gave nothing freely. His eyes were cold as winter stones, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The missus told you we don't have need of preaching," Thomas said, his hand resting meaningfully on the handle of the knife at his belt. "Best you move along before dark sets in. These hills can be treacherous for those who don't know them." Samuel felt the familiar stirring of the spirit that came when he encountered souls in deepest need, even when they rejected his help. He had learned to read the signs of spiritual warfare, and this homestead fairly reeked of it. The oppressive atmosphere, the woman's fear, The man's defensive hostility, all of it spoke of secrets buried so deep that they had begun to poison everything they touched. "I understand your caution," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the calm authority of one who had faced down angry men before. "But I'm not here to bring trouble to your door. I'm here because the Lord has a way of guiding his servants to where they're needed most, whether we understand his purpose or not." Thomas's eyes narrowed, and Sarah took an involuntary step backward. But before the man could respond, Samuel heard something that made his blood run cold. A sound so faint that he might have imagined it, carried on the wind like a whisper from the grave. It was the sound of children crying, muffled and distant, coming from somewhere beneath the house. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, and Samuel saw the exact instant when Thomas realized what he had heard. The man's face went pale, then flushed with a dangerous anger. Sarah's hand flew to her throat, and she looked back and forth between the two men like a trapped animal seeking escape. "You're hearing things, preacher," Thomas said, his voice low and menacing. "Desert wind plays tricks on a man's ears, makes him think he hears all kinds of things that ain't there." But Samuel had spent too many years ministering to the desperate and the broken to be easily deceived. He knew the sound of children in distress, and he knew the look of adults who were hiding something that ate at their souls like acid. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture that made his stomach turn, but he forced himself to remain calm, to trust in the Lord's guidance even when it led him into darkness. "Perhaps you're right," he said quietly, "but I've found that the Lord often speaks to us through the things we think we hear on the wind. Maybe there's something here that needs tending to, something that's been weighing on your hearts." Sarah made a small choke sound, and Thomas's hand tightened on his knife. The tension in the air was so thick that Samuel could almost taste it, metallic and bitter like blood. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, and the sound seemed to break whatever spell had held them frozen. "There's nothing here for you, preacher," Thomas said finally. "Nothing but hard ground and harder people. You'd best move on while you still can." The threat in his words was unmistakable, but Samuel had faced down threats before. He had learned that sometimes the most dangerous situations were also the most necessary ones, the places where God's light was needed most desperately. He looked at Sarah, saw the tears she was fighting to hold back, and felt the Holy Spirit move within him like a flame. "I'll be camping up on the ridge tonight," he said, his voice carrying a quiet determination that brooked no argument. "If anyone has need of prayer or counsel, they'll know where to find me." As he turned to leave, leading patients toward the small rise that overlooked the homestead, Samuel felt the weight of their stares burning into his back. But he also felt something else, a sense of divine purpose that he had learned to trust above all else. The Lord had brought him to this place for a reason, and he would not abandon his post until that reason became clear. The camp he made was simple but positioned strategically. From his vantage point, he could see the entire Morrison homestead spread out below, and more importantly, he could watch for any sign of the children he was now certain were hidden somewhere on the property. As the sun set and the temperature began to drop, he built a small fire and settled in to wait and pray. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the distant sounds of the night desert, the yip of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through the sage. But Samuel's attention remained fixed on the house below, where lamplight flickered behind drawn curtains and shadows moved like restless spirits. He had learned patience in his years of ministry, the kind of patience that came from knowing that God's timing was not man's timing, and that sometimes the most important work was done in the quiet spaces between action. It was near midnight when he saw the cellar doors open like the mouth of a tomb, spilling yellow light into the darkness. Thomas Morrison emerged first, carrying a lantern, followed by Sarah bearing a tray of what looked like food and water. Samuel watched as they descended into the earth, and a few minutes later, he heard it again. The sound of children's voices, clearer now in the still night air, crying out in a mixture of fear and desperate hunger. The sound pierced through him like a blade, and Samuel felt the righteous anger of the Lord fill his chest like fire. Whatever was happening in that cellar, it was an abomination in the sight of God, and he could no longer stand by and watch. He rose from his bedroll, took up his Bible and his lantern, and began the careful descent toward the house, moving like a man called to battle against the forces of darkness. The cellar doors stood slightly ajar when he reached them, and through the gap he could see rough-hewn wooden steps descending into yellow-lit depths. The voices of the children were clearer now, mixed with the low murmur of adult conversation. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached, but his resolve never wavered. He had spent his life in service to the one who had commanded his followers to defend the innocent and speak for the voiceless, and he would not fail that calling now. He descended the steps slowly, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. The cellar was larger than he had expected, carved directly into the hillside and reinforced with timber. But what he saw when he reached the bottom made his blood run cold and his spirit cry out in anguish. 4 children sat huddled together in the far corner, their faces gaunt with hunger and their eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from prolonged captivity. They ranged in age from perhaps 6 to 12, their clothes dirty and torn, their small bodies bearing the marks of confinement. When they saw him, they shrank back further into the shadows, and Samuel realized with horror that they were chained to the wall by their ankles, the iron links disappearing into the stone like roots of some terrible tree. Thomas and Sarah Morrison stood frozen in the center of the cellar, the tray of food scattered at their feet. In the lamplight, their faces looked like masks of guilt and desperate justification, and Samuel could see the years of spiritual poison that had eaten away at their souls like acid. "Dear God," Samuel whispered, his voice breaking, "what have you done?" Sarah began to weep then, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her shattered soul. Thomas stepped forward, his hand still on his knife, but there was no real threat in his posture now, only the hollow defensiveness of a man who knew he had been caught in the deepest sin. "You don't understand," Thomas said, his voice cracking. "You don't know what it's like out here, what a man has to do to survive. These children, they were orphaned in the Apache raids 3 years ago. We found them wandering in the desert, half dead from thirst and exposure." Samuel moved closer to the children, his heart breaking at the way they flinched from his approach. The oldest, a girl with dark hair and eyes that held too much knowledge of suffering, watched him with the wariness of a wild animal. The youngest, a boy barely old enough to walk, clung to her with desperate fingers. "We saved them," Sarah said through her tears. "We took them in, gave them shelter and food. But then we realized we couldn't let them go. The authorities would have questions, would want to know why we waited so long to report finding them. And Thomas," he said. "I said we'd raise them from nothing," Thomas interrupted, his voice growing stronger as he found his justification. "Fed them, clothed them, kept them alive when they would have died in the desert. They owe us their lives, preacher. They owe us everything." Samuel felt the Spirit move within him like a consuming fire, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of divine judgment. "You speak of saving them, but you have made them slaves. You speak of giving them life, but you have buried them alive in this tomb. Whatever debt you imagined they owed you, it was paid in full the moment you chose to hide them away from the light of day." The children had begun to creep forward, drawn by the gentleness in his voice despite their fear. Samuel knelt down slowly, making himself smaller and less threatening, and extended his hand toward the girl. She studied him for a long moment, then slowly reached out and touched his fingers with her own. "What are your names?" he asked softly. The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm Mary, this is my brother Jack, and these are Emma and little Pete. We used to live in Cedar Creek before the raiders came." Samuel's heart clenched at the sound of her voice, so young and yet so old, carrying the weight of suffering that no child should ever have to bear. He could see the hunger in their faces, the pallor of those who had lived too long without sunlight, and he felt the righteous anger of the Lord burn within him like a brand. "How long have you been down here?" he asked gently. Mary looked toward Thomas and Sarah, then back at Samuel. "Since the snow melted. They said we had to stay hidden because there were bad men looking for us, but I think they were lying." "They were lying," Samuel confirmed, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't belong down here in the dark. You belong in the light, with people who will care for you properly." Thomas stepped forward then, his face twisted with a mixture of fear and desperation. "You don't understand what you're doing, preacher. These children have nowhere else to go. We're all they have left in the world. Without us, they'd be dead or worse." Samuel rose slowly, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face. In the lamplight, he could see the man's soul laid bare, the fear, the greed, the terrible loneliness that had driven him to this desperate act. But he could also see something else, something that gave him hope even in this darkest of places. "You're wrong," Samuel said quietly. "They have God, and they have the promise of a better life than this. You took them in when they were lost, and that was good. But then you let your fear turn love into possession, and possession into cruelty. You forgot that these children are not your property. They are God's children, entrusted to your care, not your ownership." Sarah collapsed then, falling to her knees beside the scattered food. "We didn't mean for it to happen this way," she sobbed. We were so lonely, Thomas and I. We tried for children for so many years, and when we found them, it felt like God had finally answered our prayers. But then we were afraid that if anyone knew, they'd take them away from us." Samuel knelt beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "Fear makes monsters of us all, Sarah, but it doesn't have to end this way. You can choose a different path, even now." The cellar fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's weeping and the soft whispers of the children comforting each other. Samuel could feel the weight of the moment, the balance between damnation and redemption that hung in the air like smoke. He had seen this moment before, in other places and with other souls. The instant when a person stood at the crossroads between darkness and light and had to choose which path to follow. Thomas stood frozen, his hand still on his knife, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. Samuel could see the battle raging within him, the desire to protect what he saw as his family warring with the knowledge that what he had done was wrong. It was a battle that would define not only his own soul, but the fate of 4 innocent children who had already suffered more than any human being should have to endure. "Let them go," Samuel said softly. "Let them go, and I will help you find a way to make this right. Keep them chained in darkness, and you will damn not only your own souls but theirs as well." The minutes stretched like hours, and Samuel felt the presence of the Almighty in that underground chamber, waiting with infinite patience for these broken souls to choose their path. He had learned that some of the most important victories in the battle between good and evil were won not through violence or force, but through the simple act of offering hope to those who had forgotten it existed. Finally, Thomas's shoulders sagged, and his hand fell away from his knife. The fight went out of him all at once, leaving him looking smaller and older than his years. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small iron key, holding it as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. "I never meant for them to be prisoners," he said, his voice breaking. I just wanted to be their father." Samuel took the key gently from his trembling hand. "Being a father means wanting what's best for your children, even when it breaks your heart. These children need sunlight and fresh air, proper food and clean clothes, and most of all, they need to know that they are loved without conditions, without chains." As Samuel knelt to unlock the shackles that bound the children, he felt the weight of divine purpose settling on his shoulders like a mantle. This was why the Lord had guided him to this place, why he had felt the unease in his spirit when he first saw the Morrison homestead. Not just to rescue these children, though that was part of it, but to offer redemption to 2 souls who had lost their way in the darkness of fear and loneliness. The shackles fell away with a sound like breaking chains, and the children stood slowly, their legs unsteady from confinement. Samuel helped them up the cellar steps into the cool night air, where they stood blinking in wonder at the star-filled sky they had not seen in months. Behind them, Thomas and Sarah followed, their faces streaked with tears and their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had done. The rest of the night passed in a blur of activity. Samuel tended to the children's immediate needs: food, water, clean clothes from Sarah's cedar chest. He examined their injuries, both physical and spiritual, and began the long process of healing that would take not days but years. Mary, the oldest, seemed to understand what was happening better than the others, and she stayed close to Samuel as he worked, as if afraid that this mercy might be taken away as quickly as it had been given. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Samuel gathered the strange little family together in the main room of the house. The children sat close to each other on the worn sofa, their eyes wide with the wonder of being inside a real home again. Thomas and Sarah sat apart, their faces showing the ravages of a sleepless night spent confronting their own souls. "There will be consequences," Samuel said gently but firmly. "The law will have to be involved, and decisions will have to be made about the children's future. But I believe that mercy and justice can walk hand in hand if we have the courage to choose the right path." He looked at each of them in turn, seeing the fear and hope warring in their eyes. "Thomas, Sarah, you have done a terrible thing, but you have also saved 4 lives. That counts for something in the eyes of both God and man. If you are willing to make amends, to help these children find proper homes and receive the care they need, then perhaps this story can have a different ending than the one you were writing in that cellar." Thomas nodded slowly, his voice hoarse with emotion. "What do you need us to do?" Samuel smiled, the first genuine smile he had felt since arriving at the homestead. "First, we're going to take these children to the territorial capital where they can be properly cared for while we sort out their future. There are good people there, people who specialize in helping orphan children find loving homes. And you two are going to help make that happen, even if it means facing the consequences of your actions." Sarah looked up at him with eyes that held the first glimmer of hope he had seen in her. Will they be all right?" Samuel knelt beside the children, his hand gentle on Mary's shoulder. "They will be better than all right. They will be free to grow up in the light, to become the people God intended them to be. And perhaps if you choose to walk the path of redemption, you might find a way to be part of their lives again, not as captors, but as the people who love them enough to let them go." The sun was fully up now, streaming through the windows and bathing the room in golden light. Samuel looked around at this strange congregation. 4 children who had been imprisoned but were now free, 2 adults who had been lost but were finding their way back to the light, and himself a traveling preacher who had followed the Lord's call into the darkest of places and found grace waiting there. As they prepared to leave the homestead, Samuel felt the familiar stirring of the Spirit that told him his work in this place was not yet finished. The children would need time to heal. Thomas and Sarah would need guidance as they faced the consequences of their actions, and he would need to help them all find their way through the maze of law and mercy that lay ahead. But for now, in this moment, it was enough that 4 children were walking free beneath the open sky, their faces turned toward the light. It was enough that 2 broken souls had chosen redemption over damnation, that love had triumphed over fear, and that the Lord had once again shown his ability to bring beauty from ashes. Samuel helped the children into the wagon that would carry them toward their new life, and as he climbed up beside them, he felt the weight of divine purpose settling on his shoulders once again. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they would walk it together, guided by the light of mercy and the promise of redemption. The dust settled behind them as they drove away from the Morrison homestead, but Samuel knew that the real journey was just beginning. In the distance, he could see the spires of the territorial capital rising like beacons of hope, and he offered a silent prayer of thanksgiving for the God who had guided him to this place at this time, for such a purpose as this. The children chattered softly among themselves as the wagon rolled along, their voices carrying the wonder of those who had been given a second chance at life. And in that sound, Samuel heard the voice of the Almighty, reminding him once again that even in the darkest places, even in the deepest cellars of human despair, the light of hope could still shine through, transforming chains into freedom, captivity into liberation, and fear into love. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.